A History of Religion in 5.5 Objects. Chapter 5, Crosses. The cross is above everything else a construction of nature's reality. M.H.J. Shoemaker's Dutch mathematician. Why not just think of it as a metal T-shaped thingy? Jon Stewart, anchor of The Daily Show. Visual technologies, from telescopes and eyeglasses to digital video and medical imaging, have reshaped human societies by changing our perspectives on what we call reality. Photographic cameras are one type of visual technology, and these alone have dramatically shifted attitudes in the past 2 centuries of life in the United States. Matthew Bradley's album prints of US Civil War battlefields brought the war to civilian consciousness. Newsreels transported the world wars directly into the seats of cinema audiences. Abraham Zapruder's 8mm movie camera unintentionally clustered the world around television sets by recording John F. Kennedy's assassination. And news commentators, speaking on September the 11th, 2001, watched video clips of the collapsing World Trade Towers and said, "It's just like a movie. We can never again imagine the world without the preconceptions provided by pictures." Many artists working in traditional media during this time turned their backs on realistic depictions of the world. Why try to paint and draw and sculpt realistically when the photographic medium can do it so much better and easier? But it was more than that. As painters in particular began to grow sceptical about how natural seeing is, seeing and believing began to go their separate ways. With Paul Cézanne as a precursor, Wassily Kandinsky, Casimir Malevich and Piet Mondrian reduced the visible world to colour and geometric form, condensing the cosmos on canvas, just as the First World War was gearing up. For his part, Mondrian began drawing trees in the early years of the 20th century, not long after the invention of cinema. Some 1906 pencil works show distinctively realistic representations and a solid sense of natural perspective. By 1912, his trees were abstracted into a series of crisscrossing lines, and barely a hint was given as to how to connect the composition to anything in nature. 3 dimensions were turned into 2. Flowing organic lines made straight. By the next decade, he was working on the compositions for which he is best remembered today. Black rectilinear lines forming a grid on a white background, with some of the quadrangles coloured in yellow, red and blue. For Mondrian, this process was not a retreat from engaging the natural world, but rather a means of connecting with a more profound reality lying under the surface of appearances. Jump ahead 3 decades and we find the stirrings of the movement called minimalism in the artistry of Agnes Martin, and carried on by Sol LeWitt, Ad Reinhardt, Donald Judd and others. As Zapruder was recording political history, Martin penciled a grid of horizontal rows and vertical columns on canvas, creating hundreds of lines crossing at perpendicular angles. In one 1964 work, she lightly painted grey hues in broad horizontal stripes over the pencil lines and titled it Trees, even though the simple painting was as far from anything arboreal as possible. "My paintings," Martin claimed, "have neither objects nor space nor time nor anything, no forms. They are lightness, about merging, about formlessness, breaking down form." In Martin's artwork, the minimal gives rise to the mystical, and at its heart are a series of crisscrossing lines. There was a tree, back in the mythical beginning, and the only way to connect with its reality now is through abstraction, so that it triggers an experience in the body of the viewer, rather than prompting an intellectual preconception of what a tree is. In a world of quick access to all things deemed reality, visual contemplation, taking time to see, becomes its own virtue for Martin. A cross and a grid are not equivalent, though they work from the same visual principle. For Martin and Mondrian, the image of a grid, a series of intersecting crosses, became the cornerstone of painting. The lowest common denominator, the most primal markings made by human hands that still might be called art. Their work is akin to that of the priests and shamans and lay people who took the basic sounds of the thumping drum or the simple solidity of stones and turned them into highly conceptual and powerful objects at the centre of religious worship. Only here the museum becomes the temple. Visually speaking, nothing is more primeval, more fundamental to the connection between nature and culture and between human and divine than the sight of 2 crossed lines. In writing about a history of religion and then discussing crosses, it would be easy to suggest a cross is related to the Christian tradition. Indeed it is, but it is much more than that, related to many traditions in many ways. Even the Christian tradition displays a diversity of cross uses that are not often recognisable. And so in this chapter, I want to show the deep visual evocations that cross lines have had in a number of places in time and space. Along the way, we'll also look at the many varieties of Christian crosses and their precedents. Crosses, we'll see, evoke mystical visions, seal identity, ward off evil spirits, display truth, start wars, create connections, and stand as a basis for art. Crosses are cosmic. They are visible points of focus that unlock deeper, often visible forces. This is as true for Euro-American abstract artists like Mondrian and Martin as it is for Native American sacred imagery, ancient Egyptian amulets, and many others. Meditating with a yantra, a small cosmogram, often in cruciform, helps Hindus and Jains achieve meditative focus and connect with deities. Praying before a cross in the form of the instrument of Jesus' crucifixion gives Christians the experience of comfort and perhaps redemption. These are not identical experiences, as the intellectual, aesthetic, and theological meanings differ. Yet standing in the midst of each of them are images of crossing lines. The cross is a piece of technology that provides a bridge and allows connection. Through that association comes transformation. We cross over, cross-breed, cross-pollinate, cross-dress, crisscross, and will never be the same as a result. Mondrian says, vertical and horizontal lines are the expression of two opposing forces. They exist everywhere and dominate everything. Their reciprocal action constitutes life. I recognise that the equilibrium of any particular aspect of nature rests on the equivalence of its opposites. He was influenced by the mystical mathematician by the name of M.H.J. Schoenmakers, who made comments like this one. The cross is above everything else a construction of nature's reality. The more he will meditate about the construction of the cross, the more exactly the mystic will see reality as a created fact. The artist and mathematician were writing in the Protestant-dominated Netherlands, but these statements are not those of Christian theology. Instead, they are seeing this image as something that transcends specific traditions, a sign that undergirds nature, history, and culture. Modern artistic techniques attempted to strip the cross of any institutionally religious connotations, yet artists continued to see something visually primal and thus paradoxically, potentially mystical in the rectilinear figure. This is the grid on which reality itself is built, and if we come to contemplate it, we are allowed a privileged vision. In these cosmic connections, crosses conjure erotic relationships, as is often the case with mystical perspectives. Vertical and horizontal, heaven and earth, parallel the masculine and feminine. Modern architect and theorist Adolf Loos was a key force in stripping away the ornamental, seemingly superfluous elements of buildings and art. His early treatise on the topic, provocatively titled Ornament and Crime, suggests all art is erotic. The first ornament that was born, the cross, was erotic in origin. A horizontal dash, the prone woman, a vertical dash, the man penetrating her. The sexually aggressive heterosexual stirrings here speak to a visual energy within the dashed lines of a cross. The cross is art in loosest terms, but also a basic building structure. Crossed lines operate within modern architecture, similar to the ways they function in modern painting, creating grand grids of buildings, and thus the modern steel and glass office buildings were born. Loos would influence other architects such as Mies van der Rohe, who proclaimed, "Less is more," and their combined interests were in fashioning a world without ornament, one that was streamlined, ordered and rational. Rectilinear lines stripped away the excesses and brought humans back to a pure state. Even so, this purity is no less sensual than any Baroque extravagance. Another cosmic bridge created through crossed lines is the link between life and death. To see this, we begin by looking well beyond the workings of modern art. The ancient Egyptian ankh, two crossed lines with a loop at the top, was an object carried by people and gods alike. The word ankh means life, and sometimes hints at eternal life. The object's use as an amulet, often held against a person's chest, displays its power to protect. Many hieroglyphs display Egyptian deities carrying ankhs, and people were buried with them because they served as protective devices into the afterlife. The boy pharaoh, King Tutankhamun, was buried with various images of ankhs, including one striking gold mirror box in this shape. The ankh probably has an erotic element too, since some have surmised that the straight lines represent Osiris and the oval represents Isis. Early Egyptian religious life was polytheistic, and families were devoted to particular deities among a pantheon. In contrast, worship of the supreme god Aten developed through the reign of the pharaoh Akhenaten, whose name is literally the living spirit of Aten, in the 14th century BCE. Aten was a creator god, a singular being who, unlike the other deities, had no consort or offspring, and was symbolised by a sun disk. Images of this sun disk at times displayed rays coming down to the earth, and at the end of the rays were ankhs made as gifts to kings and queens such as Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The supreme god reaches to earth and offers a cross. In despite of the pharaoh's attempts to bring this monotheistic practice into the hearts of the people, devotion did not last, and Egypt became dominated again by polytheism after Akhenaten. The appeal of this ancient symbol and its widespread location in a collective visual storehouse of memories have made it a prop for many contemporary pop culture productions, even without the artist having knowledge of Egyptian history. Ankhs have appeared in television shows like Lost and Logan's Run, in music videos and on album covers by jazz experimentalist Sun Ra and hard rock band Kiss, and in video games such as World of Warcraft and Ultima. And the ankh has been revived as a symbol across contemporary New Age and neo-pagan rituals, such as the modern movement called Kemeticism, which seeks to restore select ancient Egyptian ways. Christians too have seen crosses in quasi-mystical realms. Here crosses are associated with the death of Jesus, and thus connected with the redemptive, life-giving dimensions of this sacrifice. But at times the image itself takes on a visionary quality of a connecting point, uniting the heavens and earth. I remember a sketch from my childhood Sunday school depicting two sides of a great canyon. Bridging the two was the cross, representing Jesus, lying horizontally and connecting one side, fallen humanity, to the other, God. In the late 16th century, theologian and poet St. John of the Cross had a mystical vision of a crucified Christ. Nothing too unusual among the pious, but the vision prompted him to sketch what he saw, an image of the crucifixion from the top down, as if a God's eye view, with the cross and body suspended in space. In St. John's version, the cross hangs between heaven and earth, which provides something of a visual metaphor of the theology of the cross, a meeting point between the two realms, as Jesus becomes a sacrifice, the atonement that brings God and humans, heavens and earth, together. The image was taken up by a latter-day Spaniard, Salvador Dali, in his 1951 Christ of St. John of the Cross. Dali himself had a visionary dream in which he saw something similar to St. John's vision, only taken in a new direction. Under Dali's surrealist brush, Christ becomes wholly detached from earth, floating in the sky above Port Flegate, Catalonia, his body no longer suffering, the blood and nail holes cleared away. Dali wanted a metaphysical Christ, something distinct from the earthbound, suffering bodies that were prominent across the centuries in the Iberian Peninsula and in the northern European Reformation styles of Matthias Grunewald and others. While he hangs at the nexus of heaven and earth, there is little earthly left in Dali's Jesus. The oil paint depicts a Gnostic version of the Gospel. The image of crossed lines is ordinary and simple, and this is part of its power. I once heard the novelist Toni Morrison surmising that children's pencil scratchings on paper, or whatever surface children decide to write on, eventually coalesce into two lines that cross each other, and that is the first recognisable visual symbol a person might create. Whether the child understands this is another matter. The image of the cross is the meeting of two lines, situated, suspended, or otherwise located between the heavens and earth, between life and death, between masculine and feminine, between infancy and adulthood, weaves its way across ancient and modern traditions. Its basic visual appearance becomes the grid work on which reality is built. Looking at a cross may stimulate a visual centripetal force that moves the eye inward to the crux of the lines, the meeting spot between vertical and horizontal. At this point, we're led to conjure crossings, mixings, and mergings, as noted above. The meeting of two lines fuels metaphysical ponderings, but if our eyes follow the cross centrifugally, looking to the ends and edges, we find 4 points leading outward, mapping themselves onto the physical space around, a sacred geometry. The Chinese character for the number 10 is a cross. The character carries connotations of perfection and completeness. Oracle bones, dating as far back as the 14th century BCE, indicate only a vertical line for the number 10, but sometimes during the Bronze Age, a horizontal line was added. The etymological dictionary Xuen from around 100 CE suggests that with the crossing lines, the number is complete. That is, it combines the horizontal line that corresponds to east and west with the vertical line for north and south, and thus comprising all four directions. Some of the earliest Chinese cosmological conceptions about the shape of the world are seen on the oracle bones from 2,500 years ago, during the Shang dynasty. Found among the inscriptions are indications of the four directions or quadrates, Sifang, made up of the east, west, north and south. Each of these was also the home of one of the four winds and became associated with four gods. A fifth quadrate was eventually added to the conceptual framework, the centre. The centre is not a direction per se, but pragmatically it makes sense. There can be no directions without a grounding point. The cosmos, then, was cruciform, sometimes noted through the character Ya, shape of which became the footprint for ancient temples, and the five quadrates were themselves charted onto multiple layers of cosmological significance. Overseeing this was the high god Di. The political world mirrored the world of the heavens, with four spokes meeting at the centre of the world, where Di and the ruler engaged, where rituals were performed and power transferred. The number 5 worked as a primary metaphor, based in a spatial experience that took on abstract philosophical importance. 5 became a constant refrain in the rituals, myths, ideas and symbols of ancient China on into the contemporary age. As Taoist practices and views began to take hold in the first millennium BCE, the number 5 was undergirded by the primary dual forces of yin and yang. Supporting these were the Tao itself, the original formless stuff at the base of all that exists. As Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching puts it, the Tao is eternally nameless. The deepest reality or nature is the Tao, and from this primordial, chaotic realm emerges two forms, yin and yang. These two become associated with male and female, light and dark, hot and cold, and other opposites. They are complementary, equal and opposing forces. Yin and yang energies then produce a sequence of movements, phases of being numbering 5. In texts from the Tao Te Ching to the I Ching and later in commentaries on the I Ching, such as the Elemental Changes, the prominence of the number 5 is reaffirmed as the 5 phases become a religious, cultural, political ordering grid. In this system, the 5 cardinal points, east, south, centre, west, north, match up with the 5 seasons, spring, summer, transitional, period, autumn, winter. The 5 elements, wood, fire, earth, metal, water, the 5 primary colours, green, yellow, red, white, black, the 5 sacred mountains, Taishan, Hengshan, Hunan, Songshan, Huashan, Hengshan or Shaanxi, and the 5 senses, sense organs, eye, tongue, mouth, nose, ear. The mythological and cosmological movement from Tao to yin and yang to the 5 phases parallels many systems through the history of the world's religions, from primordial chaos to increasing differentiation and categorization. In broad strokes, the way of the Tao, then, is not dissimilar to modern art or mystical visions of Christians or Kabbalistic conjurings of incense or drummed rhythms of the Yoruba. All these traditions use technological tools of differentiation to bring practitioners back to a primordial state where all is unified, to the formless and seamless origins of nature. One basic tool is the formation of crossed lines, a spatial accounting of how the cosmos maps onto the cardinal directions and mountain peaks, and ultimately the human body and social life. The Taoist symbol of yin and yang has become a well-known image, often misused in modern consumer culture as a logo. It consists of a circle with a black swirling segment with a white eye, contrasted with a white swirling segment with a black eye. They enfold each other and are the mirror image of each other. It is the Chinese version of crossed lines as discussed above. Agnes Martin's comments about her grid paintings being about formlessness breaking down form could be understood in Taoist ways. The perpendicular lines in modern art, among the Egyptians and eventually for Christians, stand for the basic structures of the universe. Within the Taoist symbolism, the lines are curved. These are not the same exact ways of seeing the world, and their differences are illuminating. Yet it is intriguing to see how each begins with a 2-part interconnected system, each of which is made into primary forms of the universe. Centuries and continents away, nestled in the highest mountains of South America, lies the Andean village of Misminay, between the Peruvian city of Cusco and the famed Inca temple ruins of Machu Picchu. In Misminay's symbolic mythology, cruciform imagery stands for the general layout of the cosmos. The universe is structured around dual intersecting axes, one on Earth and another in the heavens, astronomically observable in the rotation of the constellations in the clear, high-elevation night sky. The heavens are divided into a four-part Suyu system, and each of these has its own stellar cross overseeing it. Each of these is, in turn, associated with solstices and equinoxes, and thus also with seasons. After contact with Christians and an appropriation and reuse of the Christian theology of the cross, the Quechua-speaking community adapted the Spanish term Cruz Calvario, Cross of the Cavalry, to refer to the Milky Way at its annual zenith in the sky. The Milky Way forming the chief axis that divides the celestial firmament. Mixed with these Christian concepts are the gods of the mountains, the Wamanes, who are sometimes represented by crosses standing at the apex of mountains, looking not unlike Jesus' cross at the top of Mount Calvary. Irrigation canals then flow downward from that point, supplying divine water to the people and water for food crops. These cosmic quarterings are taken up in everyday objects and spatial orderings of the Mismine village. At the village centre is a chapel called Crucero, or Cross. Within it are 3 community crosses. The chapel is the centre because it draws people to it for communal gatherings and religious events, but also because it is the geographic crux of the community, the point at which 2 football paths intersect, and the point at which 2 irrigation canals cross each other. The 2 footpaths and 2 irrigation canals run parallel to each other, and they serve to divide the village itself up into 4 sections, with a social organisation and hierarchy based on the 4 quarters. As with the Mismine, cruciform imagery is found across indigenous traditions throughout North and South America. The number 4, for example, permeates the culture of the Navajo or Diné of the southwestern United States, indicating everything from the 4 cardinal directions, 4 colours, 4 sacred mountains, 4 times of the day, and 4 periods of a human lifespan. As such, a cross with its 4 points appears on weavings through Navajo culture. The Sioux use a sacred hoop, medicine wheel, a cross within a circle, as a representation of the 4 directions within the world. And the Ojibwe make the shape of a sacred hoop from stones laid out on the ground, with each stone in the cross and circle representing a different spirit, direction, animal or virtue. The setting can be used for healing purposes. Uses of crosses as icons, cosmic maps, healing objects, talismans and metaphorical principles within the Americas predate Christian contact. The European colonisation of the Americas nonetheless brought new synthetic ways of seeing both the traditional crosses of the native peoples and the Christianised versions of the image. The crossing of crosses produced ever new stories and traditions. Somewhere in the movements from the centripetal to centrifugal and back, from the intersection to ends, the cross forms a basic grid for mapping the world. A technological orientation device interlinking the mythical world of the heavens and gods with the perceivable physical world of humans. The cross is a bridge transporting us across, through, over, up to meet our stars, our gods, our people. A collection of crosses hangs on one of my office walls. The crossbars of a Celtic cross I purchased on the Isle of Iona in Scotland bloom into a tree of life. The post and crossbar of a brass crucifix from Spain is meticulously ornamented with fine floral lines. A wooden cross from Mexico, given to me as a gift, has brightly coloured tile work attached to the standard slats. Another Mexican cross has tiny mirrors inserted behind tin frames at the 4 points, a fact that I've always associated with Martin Luther's statement about how we all carry the very nails of Christ's crucifixion in our pockets. We look at the points of this cross and see ourselves reflected. If traditions from Central America to China to Egypt took 2 crossed lines and made them a fundamental marker for connecting with the contours of the cosmos, Christians took the simplicity of the crossed lines and created elaborate structures. Deriving from the iconoclastic Protestant Reform heritage of the Netherlands, Mondrian was able to pare down the symbolism of crossed lines to the barest minimum. But most of Christendom has seldom believed that Diderot's assertion that less is more. Christian crosses have merged perpendicular lines with circles, or added extra lines here and there, or morphed the crosses into trees, or appended flowers, colours and ornaments. For Christianity, the cross is what anthropologist Sherry Ortner calls a summarising symbol. That is, it is a material object that sums up and stands in for a larger system. It represents many ideas, attitudes and meanings, all at the same time. This is not the cross as visual contemplation point, as in several of the above examples, but here it is a symbol that has moved into a conceptual framework. Summarising symbols are not mere abstractions, however. They instead represent, for participants, in an emotionally powerful and relatively undifferentiated way, what the system means to them. Bringing together multiple ideas and feelings, these key symbols do not encourage reflection on the logical relations among these ideas, nor on the logical consequences of them as they're played out in social actuality over time and history. Rather, they are a crystallisation of commitment. People act because of such symbols, even to the point of creating a love it or leave it, either or mode of being. Such symbols speak, telling people how to behave, how to lay out their land, where to place their valuables, and with whom all these things should be done. But they don't speak with much nuance. Of course, to say as Ortner does that the cross is a summarising symbol for Christianity can only be an abstract rhetorical point, because the reality is that there is no one cross, as we have already begun to see. If we spend time looking with our eyes, we come to a different perspective than if we simply use words, and we begin to gather in the sensual dimensions of the primary metaphor. To explain this further, I want to hold on to the idea of the summarising symbol for the cross, but to see how far this can be pushed, and at what point it might no longer summarise, and at what point the material object no longer becomes recognisable to others for whom it is supposed to summarise ideas, feelings and commitments. One cross on my wall was a gift from my mother after she returned from working in Ethiopia. It doesn't really look like a cross, maybe more like a big key, or a metal bookmark for a family Bible. Its interlaced lines so complex at the top that it becomes more of a mesh than any easily distinguishable horizontal and vertical axes. A gathering of many crosses appears within the singular large grid of lines. If abstract artists in modern Europe took the complexities of the cosmos and compressed meaning into a few lines and colours, the Ethiopian Christian tradition turned in the opposite direction, layering lines and accreting meanings in intricate and beautiful ways. I can get lost in its designs. The 4th century bishop Frumentius, known as Abba Salama, the Father of Peace, established the Ethiopian Church. Legends say he carried a hand cross from Egypt, where he had received it as a gift from the Coptic monastic founder, Saint Pachomius. The style of the original cross is not clear, but the Egyptian ankh has been carried over from ancient religious practices into the later Christian culture and was adopted by the Coptic Christian Church in Egypt, its older meanings replaced with the newer Christ-centred theologies. The benefit of the ankh, with its loop at the top, was that it was portable, and it became a well-used hand cross. Whether or not it was an ankh that Frumentius carried, or a Greek cross, all 4 arms are of equal length, or some other style altogether, aesthetic and theological developments in Ethiopia turned the crossed lines into twisted weaves of patterns and details not seen anywhere else in Christendom. The chapter on drums already noted the lengthy history of Ethiopian Christianity, a historical reality that has given the artistic and ritualistic traditions there a long time to steep, to soak up various influences and to see what works and what doesn't, what sinks and settles at the bottom and what evaporates away. Mixing Byzantine, Islamic and indigenous East African aesthetic traditions, Ethiopia has elevated the cross into a richly diverse art form. 2 crossed lines evolving into elaborate pendants, processional markers, handheld protective devices, necklaces and other bodily ornaments. Sometimes the cross consists of a simple mark of 2 crossed lines, which may be tattooed or even branded onto the Christian foreheads. At other times, as with many hand and processional crosses, the form involves patterns of interlaced lines, weavings of metal that look at times like they could have come from the Celtic Book of Kells. At other times, like the backdrop to a Southeast Asian Buddhist icon. At others, like an obscure Baroque parlour utensil, or all of them at once. Some copper, bronze and silver crosses have central plates with etchings of Christ, though usually the representational aspects are minimal. Further, these crosses are a long way from anything that could be effectively used for an execution. In their grandest form, Ethiopian Christian crosses are abstractions, improvisations on a theme of a cross, and through that they essentially evoke devotion, feelings and behaviours among their adherents. Lay Christians in Ethiopia wear small neck crosses for protection against sickness and evil spirits, while priests will carry a hand cross, 10 to 25 centimetres, as an identifying sign, holding it up against their breast while being photographed and passing it down to sons and grandsons. Such crosses are both looked at and touched, engaged through 2 senses. Another type of cross, the processional cross, is larger. It fits onto a pole and is raised in part so that it is not touched, thus ensuring some of its sacrality, or at least channeling the sacred element solely into a visual sensibility. Within the highly developed liturgy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, 3 types of crosses are used. They're difficult to distinguish simply by looking at them, but they each have different functions. One is kept in a special storage area, often not far from the cabarot, and taken out and touched only by officiating priests during the worship services. Another is used as the incense cross, carried by a deacon in one hand as he swings a censer in the other. A third is used by the debtaras, the liturgical leaders mentioned in the chapter on drums, who hold them during their sacred swaying and dancing to the beat of the cabarro. Crosses in Ethiopia are used well beyond official worship, and they supply magical and healing powers. As throughout the Christian world, crosses perform miracles, protect people from harm, and are weapons in spiritual battles. In fact, the first known image of a crucifix used in Christianity dates from around 200 CE, from the eastern Mediterranean region. It is a small jasper amulet with a Greek inscription that weaves the names of Son, Father, and Jesus Christ into a magical chant, alongside other magical names. Similarly, Christian clergy in many places manually enact the sign of the cross, invisible in mid-air, to offer blessings to people. Clearly, none of this would have continued to have impact without the central event of the crucifixion of Jesus on a cross, but looking at the functions of central crosses in Christianity reveals at least 2 things. First, that the cross's evocative power may derive from deep cosmic connections not dissimilar to those found in many other traditions around the world. Second, crosses have multiple meanings and functions across Christian traditions, and their symbolic value does not readily stay still. Crosses are monsters in more ways than one. They're monstrous, serving as symbols of gruesome forms of capital punishment. The accused, accursed body put on display. The word monster itself stems from the Latin monere, which is to warn, and related to the verb monstrare, which translates to English as to show or reveal. A cross used for crucifixion shows, warns, and portends, lets you too stray from the way of the Roman Empire and end up on display yourself. No doubt, due to its monstrous nature, Christians did not go about using crosses as symbols until a couple of centuries after the death of Jesus. While they are a quick and easy reminder of the 2 millennia old tradition today, most early Christians were rightfully reticent to use such an object to portray their faith, opting instead for quasi-pagan tropes like Jesus as a good shepherd or a fisher of men. Wearing a cross during the time of Jesus would be like someone today wearing an electric chair as a pendant around their neck, a representation of an instrument of execution. Except that very few of us today have actually seen an electric chair, as we keep our executions hidden away from any monstrous showing. In the Christian tradition, crosses also take the form of a monstrance. Essentially, monstrances are ornate, heavily gilded display cases, anywhere from a few centimetres high to a metre or more, often in cruciform. Within them is contained a relic of a saint or the bread of communion. The consecrated host becomes the body of Christ. A small window is typically built into the work, allowing viewers to look at the remains there. The term monstrance is used because the structure puts an object on show. A monstrance provides a beautiful covering for what might be a rather abject object. Fingernail clippings of St. Clare, the tooth of St. John the Baptist, an arm bone of St. George, the breast milk of Mary, the foreskin of Jesus. Elaborate, gold-plated, finely crafted pieces of technology form the showing room for the more natural bodily object. One monstrance at the Monastery of the Incarnation of Avila, Spain, contains the drawing of Christ's crucifixion as sketched by St. John of the Cross after his mystical vision. I can think of few things that more ably show the subtle, strange power of sacred objects than a monstrance now in the collection of the Art Institute of Chicago. It is from 15th century Germany and represents the silversmithing techniques of that provenance. Shaped in the form of a cross about 22 centimetres high, it contains a relic of the 3rd century martyr St. Christina. The relic in this case is a bone, possibly a finger bone, but none of that can be readily verified. In finely crafted, perfectly symmetrical silverwork is a small window at the crux of the cross, allowing us to peer at the specially situated bone fragment of an 1800-year-old human. Some devout people would call this disgusting. Many secular-minded would see it as evidence of backward beliefs. Others have travelled many miles, spending and risking much to see such a sight, now placed in the clean, well-lit galleries of a major museum. The material body, decaying and imperfect though it may be, stands at the heart of the seemingly smooth operations of religious worship. A number of other religious traditions also enshrine relics. They're especially prominent in Shia Islamic traditions. Clippings of Muhammad's beard are key. Mahayana Buddhism, the Buddha's teeth, and Greek religions, Agamemnon's sceptre. In this vein, we might also consider Vladimir Lenin's body embalmed and behind glass in his mausoleum near the Kremlin, or Britney Spears' chewing gum auctioned at up to $14,000, or William Shatner's kidney stone sold for $25,000 as modern secular versions. While a fuller description is beyond the scope of this book, relics do portray the power of objects to shape religious devotion and the prominent function of the body within devotion. Bodies devoted to other bodies. The most monstrous cross in the modern world is the Nazi swastika. Its sign has sanctioned violence, greed, deception, the rampant yet restrained lust for power, and ultimately genocide. Writing in Mein Kampf in the 1920s, Adolf Hitler claimed, "In the swastika, the National Socialists see the mission of the fight for the victory of Aryan man, and at the same time also the victory of the idea of creative work, which in itself is and will always be anti-Semitic." That is a lot to claim for a few perpendicular lines. The first half of the swastika's mission failed. The Aryans were not victorious, but the second half arguably did. Today, across the Western world, the swastika is an instant visual trigger of anti-Semitism. Swastika is an ancient Sanskrit term meaning good luck or good being. In other words, for a few millennia, the image has signified happiness and pleasure, appearing across devotional images of the Devas and Devis, gods and goddesses of South Asia and beyond. Max Muller, one of the earliest champions of comparative religions, argued in the late 19th century that the right-turned swastika was the true one and the left-turned one false, a notion occasionally and optimistically reiterated still today in an attempt to sever the connection between Hindus and Nazis. There is no real evidence for this assertion in general, and indeed left and right-turned swastikas appear side by side on temple walls, pottery and palms of hands. In its more profane sense, the swastika has traditionally been a charm or amulet that is worn, adorns walls or is carried. Historically, its sacred uses have taken these well-meaning purposes and amplified them. It is one thing to receive a blessing as you enter your neighbour's house. It is another to have the Buddha or Ganesha give you a sign of blessing, palm facing out, swastika in hand. Muller himself said that the term swastika should not be used outside its South Asian context. Call it its many misuses promiscuous. And there is something to his point, because he attempts to keep meanings strictly separated. But symbols seldom obey the limits of nations, cultures, religions or languages, or an academic philologist, and so the term has spilled over into many contexts to name the same visual figure. I use it here as shorthand for a specific style of cross, thus akin to speaking of a Greek cross or an ankh. Just as I use the term because it affects response, and it is the ongoing visual verbal repercussions and reverberations that are of interest. It is the endless morphings of meaning of this cross that makes it a curious object for a history of religions. Perhaps the original visual symbol was, if we dig back far enough, a sun in motion, or some version of a sun god, a spinning wheel of life with spokes, whirling logs, stages of human spiritual evolution, or a calendar. A millennium-old monument of runes in Denmark has the mark, as does a burial ground in Ohio from 2 millennia ago. Buddhist temples have long been marked by swastikas, and one old written source says that the Buddha himself had a swastika mark on his chest. A 19th century archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, excavated the archaic city of Troy and found similar images of the crossed lines throughout its architecture and objects. Jains will spread a handful of flour or rice on a flat circular space and draw 4 lines into it with their fingers, swiping away portions of the substance and leaving the imprint of a swastika as a blessing. The history of the imagery is diverse. While the quest for the swastika's origins became especially fanatical, starting in the late 19th century, Edward Butts, a civil engineer from St. Louis, made finding its genesis his life's avocation. Writing in 1908, he fell under the swastika's sway, rhapsodising in ways almost unthinkable today. To our minds, it appears much like a beautiful cloud that once floated above the setting sun, tinted with brilliant colours. Between 1870 and 1933, around a dozen books and numerous articles were published in English on the subject of the swastika, some by eccentric hobbyists, others by earnest anthropologists. During that time, the symbol was used by individuals as diverse as the Philadelphia gathering of the Girls' Club of America, the US 15th Infantry, and the personal logo that accompanied Rudyard Kipling's signature. During this time too, those constructing the history of the Aryan race were consistently using the symbol. Hitler's quote above summarises this connection. The quest for origins of art, religion, symbols, language that so dominated Western cultures, arts and scientific endeavours in the 19th century took hold in the quest for racial origins as well. The European push to establish the legacy of the Indo-European peoples resulted in a new set of distinctions, including terms like Caucasian and Aryan, Aryan being a subset of the larger category Caucasian, which also included Semitic people. Max Muller used the term Aryan to think historically about the roots of language, but others took the distinctions engendered by the term and used these differences to construct physical anthropological histories that, not unsurprisingly, wound up portraying the Aryans as a superior race. Through these creations of history, the swastika was part and parcel of the search for, or construction of, the Aryan race. At the Paris Exposition of 1889, a Polish archaeologist named Michael Zmigrodzki exhibited more than 300 of his drawings of the swastika found around the world, many of these inspired by Schliemann's Troy excavations. Zmigrodzki was but one of many of his time engaging the simultaneously search for the pure race alongside the search for the pure image. 100 years later, Malcolm Quinn observed the visual outcomes of this connection coalescing in Nazi Germany, suggesting that the swastika was a sign in which a modern mass was encouraged to see itself as an ancient community. Quinn draws attention to the ways people at pageants and party rallies in Nazi Germany would arrange themselves in a giant human-made swastika, thus reinforcing the summarising symbolism. Hitler, Joseph Goebbels and the rest of the Nazi propaganda team turned out to be shrewd designers, blending religious myths, rituals and symbols to create identity to their liking. To be pro-Aryan was the correlative of anti-Semitism. Identity consistently formed out of difference, and the swastika was the identifying mark. Contemporary graphic designer Stephen Heller gets as much of the symbol's appeal, not because of grand mythologies, but through its modest design. Like most effective symbols, the swastika's geometric purity allows for legibility at any size and distance. Purity was a virtue, the geometries of the world stripped down to a few lines, like the modern art of the time. Even so, the Nazis' sense of purity was not that of the artists. Hitler, Goebbels and others were adamant in their denunciation of abstract art. Their much publicised Degenerate Art exhibition of 1937 included works by Kandinsky and Mondrian, as well as other abstract painters who were also seeking a newer, more primal mode of expression, but in strikingly different ways and for different purposes. Though its intent was to showcase the negative dimensions of modern art, those in opposition to the Nazi ideals, the exhibition was the largest viewing of modern art the world had ever seen, and was bigger than almost any other modern art exhibition to this day. More than 600 works were displayed over 3 months in Munich, attracting more than 3 million visitors. Symbolic battles are not merely ideological, but they are often battles over symbols themselves. An understanding of political, social and religious warfare cannot afford to disregard the material basis of symbolic and metaphoric communications. Having been re-symbolised, reappropriated and renamed as a sign of the Nazis and the sign of mass genocide, the swastika can never be renamed again. Some assert can never be rendered benign. Quinn convincingly argues that the contemporary use of examples of pre-Nazi swastikas, such as those given above, can be seen in the present day for their seeming innocence only because of their Nazi usage. In other words, isn't it quaint that before the Nazis, a girls' club in Philadelphia used a swastika for its group? And just as the Ethiopian processional cross retains a sense of sacrality because it is lifted up beyond tangible access, banning the display of the swastika in Germany may actually reinforce its ongoing cultist power. While copious books have been written on the swastika, and my sketches here just scratch the surface of the multitude of meanings, it is essential to include it among the historical view of crosses. To conclude this section, I relate two brief stories that bespeak the power of images. The power of crossed lines as a visual image, and the way that cross-cultural understandings overlap, conflict, and are remade. A picture in the February 29th, 1940 New York Times shows a half-dozen Native Americans lined up in front of a poster with a large swastika on it. Looking closer, one realises they are signing the poster. Barely visible on the poster are two lines crossing out the swastika. The caption tells the story. Arizona Indians banned their swastika to show disapproval of the Nazis. I could not find any deeper information about this story, who the people were or what tribes were pictured. 4 tribes were supposedly represented. But I was moved by the gesture, by the crossing out of the already crossed lines quite truly stolen from them. And the fact that a group of people who had suffered near genocide themselves saw the dangerous and powerful use to which symbols can be put. The other story involves the modern artist Joseph Beuys, one of the most influential artists of the modern age, who began incorporating crosses early in his artistic career. Beuys was a pilot for the Nazi Luftwaffe, and he would have displayed the swastika in some form or other during his flying time. He later turned to art, famously incorporating materials not before found in museums. Felt and fats were the 2 most prominent media, and continuing to challenge social perceptions of art. Situated in a divided Germany after the war, Beuys' work aimed for social change. The figure of the cross, though not a swastika, hung over his works as he sought mendings of the past and present, of West and East. His first image of a cross was 1943, a sketch of a nurse with a medical cross on her hat, and thus for him an initial sign of healing. His friend Heine Bastian succinctly tells of the artist's attachment to the simple form. The cross stands for a possible society, for an infinite guilt indefinitely in need of absolution, for silence, but not the silence of death, for morality, but not that felt in the face of death. Beyond, though, not without Christianity, the cross divides while it might also unite. In this sign you will find victory. These are the words Jesus is said to have spoken to Constantine, accompanied by a vision of a cross of light. The words and image together did lead to victory for the emperor, marking the moment of his conversion to Christianity and altering human civilization forever after. Crosses and civilizations are bound up with each other, meaning also that crosses and war frequently meet. Since Constantine's time, Europe has fairly consistently been governed and gone to war under the sign of the Christian cross, and even today, many European nations carry a cross as a primary symbol in their flags. As Christianity became dominant and politics, social life and theology intertwined, the cross shifted from a sign of crucifixion to a sign of victory. The cross may be a focal point for meditation and prayer, and devout Christians will pray before a cross at the front of a church or on a household wall. But the cross has also often been used as a symbol of courage and group loyalty, leading the holy into war. As the old hymn puts it, onward Christian soldiers, marching as to war, with the cross of Jesus going on before. Flags with crosses led the way across the continent to the Crusades. They were carried in the midst of the 30 Years' War, and they were present on various sides in the Crimean, Franco-Dutch and Napoleonic Wars, to name but a few. Crosses and swords crossing each other. And it's not just Nazis and Christians who go to war with crosses. In the Yucatan Peninsula in 1850, a cross appeared near a well and began to speak of God's love and power, and the Mayans who heard it were summoned to battle against their oppressors. The European descended Yucatecos. The story of the talking cross of the caste wars of the Yucatan has been told and retold through Christian and indigenous perspectives many times. The talking cross was not so much an apparition in the Roman Catholic sense as it was an indigenous Mayan cosmological event. The cross was not an unsurprising image for the Mayans, who had long communicated with ancestors and deities through cruciform icons. Even after the Mayan rebels were defeated in war, the talking cross continued on, forming its own religious following. The cross continued to speak to the people and to provide holy water for them in the well, and it motivated the rebels to continue their struggle for independence for many decades. Shrines were built to the talking cross, and these have remained active into the present day. At times, Mayans have even used Roman Catholic crosses and repurposed them for their own significantly non-Christian means. In a wholly different yet parallel context, crosses have created conflict in contemporary high schools in the United States. In numerous separate events in recent years, students have been asked to stop wearing cross necklaces at school. A student in Minnesota was told to take off his cross and rosary beads even though he said he was wearing it in honour of his cancer-stricken grandmother. 2 boys in Albany, Oregon were suspended for wearing cross necklaces after they'd been warned to take them off. And a student in central New York was suspended for wearing rosary beads with a cross attached. There are a number of similar cases, and in many of them, the ACLU has been outspoken about the students' rights to wear the crosses, as they should be protected under First Amendment rights. Looking again at the stories, it became clear that the schools did not ban the crosses because of a seeming conflict of church and state. Instead, school officials believed the crosses and rosaries were gang symbols. Indeed, many gangs have used crosses as symbols of identity, from Celtic crosses to swastikas to the Pachuco cross tattooed on the hands of many Latino gang members, though not only gang members. Adornments, whether flags for a battalion of soldiers or necklaces for an individual body, are signs of power and belonging. Double crossing, crossing out. Crosses stand at the heart of conflict and even cause conflict. In and through their capabilities to identify groups of people collectively, they become powerful sources of cohesion, and they simultaneously become forces to show how one group stands over and against another. Mark Twain once quipped, "Clothes make the man." Naked people have little or no influence on society. We are what we wear, dressing for success, dressing up or down, ornamenting our bodies in order to have influence, to be noticed or not, and to provide a sense of self and inclusion in a larger circle. In the language of clothes, cultural observer Alison Lurie writes about the ways clothing and identity are bound to each other. For thousands of years, human beings have communicated with one another first in the language of dress. Long before I'm near enough to talk to you on the street, in a meeting or at a party, you announce your sex, age and class to me through what you're wearing, and very possibly give me important information or misinformation as to your occupation, origin, personality, opinions, tastes, sexual desires and current mood. I may not be able to put what I observe into words, but I register the information unconsciously, and you simultaneously do the same for me. By the time we meet and converse, we've already spoken to each other in an older and more universal tongue. Dress is visual, tangible, political and personal. Visible clues, speaking silently about who we are and to whom we belong. Our clothing and bodily adornments signal to others our social status, including our religious status. Religious people wear things. That's a strange and direct statement. But the basic truth of it leads quickly to the question, what do religious people wear? And when and where and why do they wear these things? A shaved head of a man peers out from long saffron-coloured robes, and we might realise he's a Buddhist monk, probably from Tibet. A woman at the farmer's market wears a simple blue billowy dress with a small laced head covering, and her status among the Amish is noted. A young man's tattoos up and down his arms and neck and across his face will denote his identity within a particular gang, the group with which he most identifies and that provides him with a sense of purpose, leaving aside ethical questions about that purpose. A man with long curling sideburns, beard and a black cap indicates his Orthodox Jewish attachments. The clothing of a young woman walking down a city street in contemporary business attire may simply indicate she has a decent job or is hoping to find one. Looking closer, a small gold cross is noticed dangling from a thin gold chain around her neck, subtly announcing her Christian convictions. Crosses have become dress, indicating identity. Crosses are emblazoned on T-shirts, attached to charm bracelets, and especially worn around the neck. They are also imprinted directly on the body. This was true long before fashion became an industry. Arguing against such fashion decisions, I recall a fundamentalist preacher from my childhood once pronounced, "People are not meant to wear crosses, crosses are meant to wear people." Take away the oval at the top of the ankh, and you're left with the tau symbol, a tau cross, so called after the Greek letter it resembles, which was itself taken from the ancient Hebrew character tab, which used to be drawn in the form of a cross. This is another ancient image of eternal life, and one used often as adornment. In the apocalyptic Hebrew scriptures of the prophet Ezekiel, a sign is given to those who will be spared the mass slaughter at the end of the world. A mark, tau, on the forehead that exempts them from judgment. In the book of Job, as he concludes his plea to God, Job defends his faithfulness in the face of tribulation, even offering his signature, his tau, to show his steadfast devotion and to keep from being indicted. Christians, such as the Franciscans, have continued to use the tau-shaped cross as an identifying mark of their order, referring to the Ezekiel passage. St. Francis himself used this style of cross, signing his letters with it, tracing its mark on his body, drawing it on the wall of his residence, and using it as St. Anthony had before him in his work with lepers. The Franciscan habit, or tunic, is also meant to mimic the tau cross when the friar stands with arms outspread. Jump ahead many years to the Ecclesia Church in Houston, part of a recent wave of Christian groups often referred to as the emerging church movement. During Lent in 2012, Pastor Chris Sear and the artist in residence at the time, Scott Erickson, encouraged congregants to get tattoos designed by Erickson as part of their Lenten practices. About 50 people got their skin inked and set up a special art exhibition called Stations on Skin to display them. Crosses were not blatantly evident in the epidermal imagery, but set within larger pictorial designs. "I totally think the cross is important," Erickson said, "but as a symbol it doesn't inspire thought anymore. It's become decorative, perhaps too much of a summarising symbol. Too many uses theologically, politically, culturally, artistically makes the thing lose its strength." If tattoos are considered a new trend in the faith, a longer history of Christianity shows otherwise. Tattoos, a Polynesian term, were otherwise known by the Greek term stigma in the ancient world, plural stigmata, a term that carries over into contemporary times, bringing with it the negative connotations of the original. A stigma was an indelible bodily mark painfully applied with needles or brands, which showed the downgraded social status of the person. Slaves and criminals were thus distinguished this way. Certain Christians adopted the stigma as a way to show their commitments, sometimes in the face of adversity, sometimes to the face in the mirror, indicating their status as a slave to God. Later deemed heretical, the 4th century Montanists used crosses as a stigma on their bodies. Persecuted Coptic Christians tattooed crosses on their own inner arms to keep them on the straight and narrow path as their faith was tried. And as mentioned above, Ethiopian Christians sometimes have a cross tattooed on their forehead to display their faith. Most of the previous examples are voluntary donnings of the cross, but there are many involuntary uses as well. Early in the 14th century, Beatrice of Planissoles was accused of Catholicism. Among other heretical ideas, the Cathars conceived of a dualistic world in which the devil, the god of darkness, was in the beginning with the god of light, overseeing the earthly physical realm. The Cathars also adhered to non-violence, taking it as far as keeping a vegetarian diet, believed in a universal redemption, and were progressive regarding the role of women in religious environments. Like many groups opposed to the official teachings and practices of the Rome-based church, the Cathars thought the official rituals to be a bit excessive. They did not make the sign of the cross upon entering a church, partly because it was linked to the violence of the crucifixion. Instead, they would touch head, nose, beards and ears and say, "This is my forehead, this is my beard, this is one ear, and this is the other." They mimicked the outward sign while reconceiving the inward aspect. The Cathars were persecuted by the Inquisition, and their followers were labelled heretics. Beatrice was accused of this heresy, largely because of her father's associations, and received a prison sentence. She was released from prison only if she would continue her penance with the common chastisement of the day. She had to wear a double yellow cross. Yellow was the colour of shame, a symbolic value taken up centuries later when Jews were forced to wear yellow stars of David, and wearing the double cross meant that every piece of their clothing except the shirt had to have 2 crosses stitched on them. Especially crucial was that the crosses had to be openly displayed any time the guilty were in public. Likewise, if you walk through the old Jewish quarter, Barrio Santa Cruz in Seville, Spain, today, you might stumble through the labyrinthine streets to find the Calle de la Cruz and see a couple of wooden crosses embedded in the siding of a house. These date back hundreds of years and were meant to signal the homes of Jewish people who were forced to convert to Christianity. Seville was under Muslim rule from the 8th century through 13th centuries, and Muslims, Christians and Jews lived together during this time, not always peaceably, though they did share many theological ideas, sacred texts, food, symbols and architectural styles. But when King Ferdinand III of Castile conquered the city and made it a Catholic space, he didn't extend much tolerance to the others, and Muslims and Jews were forced to convert. All synagogues in the city were disbanded by 1391. In 1492, while Columbus was sailing the ocean blue, starting his journey from Seville, the newly formed nation of Spain made clear that they were the Catholic nation of Spain and expelled all Jews under that year's Alhambra decree. As the last of the Muslim strongholds in Granada was taken by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were forcibly sent away. The Muslims would be expelled sometime later, while a significant minority stayed and converted. These conversos had crosses affixed to their walls, showing their conversion status, as well as supplying a medieval surveillance system so that others could keep watch on them and be sure no backsliding was taking place. As has become evident in later years, the conversos often kept up appearances but continued their Jewish practices in secret, often in the basements of those very houses marked by a cross. In the generation after Columbus, Hernán Cortés left Spain to conquer the peoples of Mesoamerica. The cross was already so prominent in the New World that Cortés saw the indigenous symbol and became convinced Christians had been there before. No evidence has ever emerged to confirm this, and clearly the native use of the cross had little relation to the Christian understanding of it. The Aztecs had used it as an emblem associated with the god Quetzalcoatl, while the Maya had used it for the god of maize, and others used it as a four directions symbol. The fact that Cortés and his men would have prominently displayed crosses on flags and staffs, and possibly around their necks, has led historians to suggest this contributed to the native Mayan and Aztec people's initial acceptance of the Spanish. They believed, as did Cortés, that they each had the same symbol and thus the same mythologies and understandings of the world. In Chiapas, Mexico, we can see the mixing and merging of traditions, with crosses in particular standing at the heart of the symbolism. Families in towns such as San Cristobal de las Casas adorned their rooftops with crosses, a practice that reached its zenith in the late 19th century and early 20th century. These were usually made of iron, fashioned in elaborate designs that improvised on the basic cross, twisting and turning the iron lines in new ways, adding suns and moons and flowers and stars and the occasional occupational symbol. On first glance, Roman Catholicism is dominant in the contemporary religious life of the communities, with churches dotting the landscape. Yet roof crosses meld various meanings. They are often used in striking unorthodox ways. As protective devices against floods, earthquakes, lightning storms and volcanoes, all of which have occurred in the area. Virginia Ann Guess has studied this tradition more than any other native English speaker, noting that in spite of the variety of symbolic values that may be attributed to the roof crosses, they share a common goal: to manipulate or live in harmony with supernatural or natural elements they can neither explain nor control. As Mesoamericans took on the cross symbols of the Spanish, they morphed and mixed it, and it became a hybrid entity, its meaning lying somewhere between European and indigenous traditions. Devotion to the cross reaches such a fervent pitch today that in Latin American practices surrounding the Festival of the Cross, Fiesta de la Cruce or Cruz de Mayo, on the 3rd of May, the cross is treated as a living being, not unlike some drums and stones we've seen. In Chiapas, crosses are dressed in new clothes, ribbons and flowers. Devotees gather to pray, burn incense and light candles. It is a Catholic festival, though not mandatory, even as the meaning of this cross often moves away from strict Orthodox conceptions. Jewellery, clothing and house markings may be accessories or adornment, yet there is no such thing as mere ornament. A fresh coat of coloured paint on a wall does not physically change the structure of a room, but the room will be experienced in a different way. One study shows that couples argue more in yellow kitchens. Likewise, the external bodily adornment changes the person who wears it, mainly because she or he is treated and experienced differently by those around them. It's like the parable of the man who wanted to hide his real identity, and so he wore a mask for such a period that his face eventually morphed to match the mask. The cross is one bodily mark of identity for those who wear it and those who see it, and an identity connected to salvation and preservation of life in the face of death. Sometimes, as Freud once quipped, a cigar is just a cigar. The same may be said for crosses. Sometimes 2 crossed lines are just 2 crossed lines. Sometimes the crossed lines are nothing more than profane, though crucial black lines on a yellow road sign warning drivers of an upcoming intersection. Sometimes they help us add up our bills and debts. Or I can look to the top right-hand corner of the keyboard I'm using now and punch in this character, the plus sign. Sometimes, perhaps, with nowhere else to go, 2 lines just cross. But symbols are sticky, attaching themselves to our collective conscious and unconscious bodies and minds. We've been trained to think about an image in one way, and no amount of rewiring seems capable of changing it, short of desires for world domination. In some ways, the simpler the symbol, the stickier it is, which is a larger part of the reason crosses are such powerful sacred objects. In the middle of the National September the 11th Memorial and Museum in Lower Manhattan stand 2 steel I-beams crossed at right angle. You might be able to picture this in your mind, since images of it flooded the news after the terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the ensuing cleanup. This one framed infrastructural remnant seemed to be the only thing left standing, and it became symbolic for many doing the rescue work. The memorial's website itself calls it an icon of hope. The American atheists sued to have it removed, so concerned were they that religion should not be part of the memorialising process. But most people were willing to forego that what might be deeply held beliefs about the separation of church and state in order to significantly memorialise a traumatic event. The crossed beams in the setting of the World Trade Center ruins have no actual connection with the Christian mythology of the crucifixion of Jesus, except as some believers and non-believers might make the connection. Jon Stewart, comic host of television's late-night spoof on news, The Daily Show, poked fun at the atheists and suggested they didn't really need to see it as a Christian symbol. Instead, Stewart offered in ways that would make Freud proud, why not just think of it as a metal T-shaped thingy? 2 other metal posts meet at right angles and cross purposes in contentious space, in this case in the middle of the Mojave National Preserve in California. The T-shaped thingy was put there by the veterans of foreign wars in 1934 to honour the dead from World War I. Originally made of wood, the cross was rebuilt several times until 4-inch steel pipes were welded together and drilled into Sunrise Rock in the Mojave in 1998 by Henry Sandoz. At this point, controversy ensued, religious symbols on public land being the problem, eventually sparking a court case, Salazar versus Buono, that went to the US Supreme Court, which handed the case back down. Initial court cases told the VFW to board up the cross, which they did, leaving a big wooden box on a pole on a rock in the desert. But after the Supreme Court case, the cross could be displayed again. To complicate things further, the metal pipe cross was stolen in 2010 as an act of protest, only to turn up in Half Moon Bay, California, a couple of years later. In November 2012, 100 people gathered for a ceremony to rededicate a new cross on the site, which through the decade-long legal battles had been turned over to private ownership. Countless hours of work, millions of dollars in private and public funding, hostility, theft, deception and anger. And now it looks little different than it did 20 years ago. 2 metal poles in the desert. Even Christian uses of the cross have been employed to the point that they carry little theological gravitas. Recall Christian artist Scott Erickson, quoted above, saying, "The cross doesn't inspire thought anymore." Or one might think of the use of the cross as a grave marker. Picture a cemetery here with rows and rows of white crosses, especially those for the war dead, their replicated forms stretching for acres. The cross that initially indicated the religious identity of the person who passed on simply became a marker of death itself. The crossed beams might offer hope to those left behind, but the threat remains that repetitious use relinquishes some of its sacred capital. I must admit, as someone who has spent a large part of my professional life researching the power of visual symbols and icons in the lives of people, the pragmatist in me wants to say, those are just 2 steel beams, a T-shaped thingy. But then again, they cannot be just that. Two crossed lines become a Rorschach test, evaluating a society's collective fears and desires, needs and entreaties. The simplest of marks debated in the highest of courts of law, the most respected of newspapers, the most serious of religious institutions. How can we explain the worldwide appeal of a cross as a primary visual symbol? How is it that two crossed lines might represent fundamental structures of the world, four directions, meeting of heavens and earth, from ancient China to Egypt, India, the Andes and the United States? The traditional scholarly answer would be to take a historical approach, to trace influences and immigrations across seas, rivers and continents, and to show linguistic developments merging and emerging in new times and places. If we just keep digging up enough old bones and uncovering sacred scriptures, we might get to the heart of it all, or so the promise goes. To be sure, the chapter could not have been written without my reliance on important historical, anthropological, philosophical, linguistic and archaeological work undertaken by people who believe that there are such singular beginnings. But I remain sceptical, as do many contemporary scholars, that a final origin can ever be found. I do not believe there is a singular original cross from which all these traditions derive their cultural meaning. Besides, what such quests are seldom able to answer is why certain objects and ideas stick and others don't. Some words and things find their way translated into other vocabularies and cultures, others don't. There is another approach, and that is to look not just to the past, but also to the present, to the varieties of human bodies and their sensual quests to find meaning, order and purpose in the things of the world. We seem to be wired this way. Our bodies, one half and incomplete, desire connection as we fill our visual perceptions with visible objects. Art historian David Friedberg begins his grand study, The Power of Images, this way. People are sexually aroused by pictures and sculptures. They break pictures and sculptures. They mutilate them, kiss them, cry before them, and go on journeys to them. They're calmed by them, stirred by them, and incited to revolt. It's a great summary of the myriad ways images have provoked people to act, to respond, stirring joy and anger, lust and fear. And as we have seen in this chapter, the imagery does not even need to be complex. In this light, one might not believe that the cognitive neurosciences could tell us why crosses have kept emerging in various times and places. Cognitive and developmental psychology might point out the ways crosses relate to rudimentary forms of our first childhood drawings and thus become a primary metaphor for our later years. Neurobiologists might use visual technologies to allow us to see deeper and deeper into the neurochemical processes of the body, observing our impulses at a base level and marking our responses to sensual stimuli. From CT and PET scans to fMRIs and MPIs, new imaging technologies are representing the body in sophisticated ways and providing newer answers to our perceptual ponderings. These hold a lot of promise, though I suspect the field is currently looking through the equivalent of Galileo's lenses, when what is needed are telescopes like Hubble's or Webb's. Ultimately, I wonder if it is not the artists and poets who have already been there, who have deciphered the meanings of the sensual signs, observed the origins of the cross, and sculpted, painted, photographed, and rhymed the creation, purifying and condensing, improvising and elaborating.